Okay, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to Inclusive Design 24. As always, Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you in partnership with Barclays Access, the Paciello Group, Intopia, Microsoft Edge, and Open Access Technologies. Don't forget, if you like what you're seeing, you can subscribe to the Inclusive Design 24 on YouTube by hitting that subscribe button. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter at ID24Conf. If you have any questions for our presenters, please tweet them using the ID24 hashtag, and we will ask them at the end of the session.
We're also saying a quick hello to all the people listening at ID24U events in Amherst, Ann Arbor, and Lincoln. Welcome back. Hope you're all still comfortably sitting down and enjoying ID24 as it happens. Our next speaker is David Caldwell, and he's going to be giving a talk on building inclusive products for vulnerable circumstances. David.
Cheers, Henny. Thanks, guys. So I'm going to be talking about vulnerability and the importance of thinking about it in the design process. So vulnerability is something that many of us find difficult to talk about. Being vulnerable isn't something we enjoy or that many of us are willing to talk about with other people for fear of seeming or feeling weak. And many of us would probably fear the consequences or the perceived consequences of letting our bank know that we're vulnerable. In essence, it's not something we invite into our lives. What makes it all the more difficult, to support individuals who are vulnerable. Now, as well as ID24 happening today, yesterday was World Mental Health Day. And so it feels really appropriate to tell you about my dad. My dad has bipolar, and he won't mind me telling you that because part of the last 10 years have been him giving me his insights about what it's been like having bipolar, and me using that as a way of building my understanding and building a culture in my organization and beyond about mental health. And whilst he's generally been well for the past few years, there was a time about 10 years ago when he wasn't. It won't be the first time. It wasn't the first time, and nor will it be the last, when my dad's manic and depressive emotional states became uncontrollable. But what happens when he's manic or depressive is symptomatic of what happens to many people with mental health issues. Managing their finances becomes difficult or impossible. In my dad's case, it meant a fundamental change to how him and my mum look after their finances and how we as a family are set up to manage if my mum was no longer around. Now, because of the way his mental health issues affect him, my dad doesn't have access to large amounts of money. And we've got a plan in place to make sure that if the worst happens, he won't be left vulnerable. But it's not just people with mental health issues that can be vulnerable. And it isn't the case for everyone that they've got a plan in place. And so it's really important that we all think about how we support people who are in vulnerable circumstances. Whilst this talk focuses on examples from the banking industry, I think it's important that you all and we all think about what our organizations can do to support people when they become vulnerable. As you'll hear, we can all become vulnerable, and vulnerability can arise in a number of different ways, sometimes when we least expect it. But before I go on and talk about that, I wanted to just give you a little bit of context about Barclays. Now, you'll have heard probably at the beginning of each of these sessions that we're supporting ID24 today. We're really proud to support ID24. It's our second year in doing that. We're really passionate about building and supporting both the inclusive design and the accessibility communities globally. We're a global bank. In fact, on the slides, it says that we're a transatlantic consumer, corporate and investment bank. Based primarily in the UK and the US, but actually we service millions of customers, about 48 million customers and clients around the world. We've got 80,000 colleagues globally, and roughly about 20 to 25,000 of those are technologists, so people who are delivering technology products to our customers across the world. And we're what was called a universal bank. So we support literally every type of banking requirement that you can imagine. So everything from retail customers like you and I, through to complex institutions and their complex needs, and pretty much everybody in between. And we're also super old, so we're about 325 years old, and we've got this purpose to create opportunities for everybody to rise, and those are underpinned by a really, really strong set of values. Now, one of the things that we've talked about more recently is about our ambition to become the most accessible and inclusive FTSE company. And it's that drives us to be here today and to support the community, because fundamentally we know that we can't deliver on that ambition if it's just an interesting topic, because it's not something that we talk about too much. As I said, it's got a fair amount of stigma behind it. And so it's sometimes worth considering what we mean by a vulnerable circumstance. So I'm going to use the FCA's definition. So for those of you who don't know, the FCA is the Financial Conduct Authority. They're a regulator in the UK. For financial services, and what they've said is that financial circumstances means that someone who, due to their personal circumstance, is especially susceptible to detriment, so loss, particularly when a firm or a bank or insurance company is not acting with appropriate levels of care. Now you can see that this definition is pretty broad and wide-ranging. And as much as it says firm, it's not that specific to financial services. And so actually it's quite a good definition that we can use more broadly, that basically says if we don't think about vulnerability as product designers and people who are creating services, then actually we're potentially putting people in harm's way. Now, as part of looking at vulnerability, I think it's worth a little refresh on impairment so that we don't get the two mixed up. So, as I've said, vulnerability can affect all of us at any time, and it's not necessarily linked to disabilities or mental health issues. But of course, there is potentially a link sometimes. Vulnerability is circumstantial, and in a moment I'll talk about that and the types of situations where that might happen. But I wanted to kind of set the context of the difference between impairment and vulnerability. So broadly speaking, we think about impairment sitting across three categories. And when we design really inclusive services, we support all three of these just by default. So the first one is a permanent impairment, or generally more commonly talked about as disabilities. So these are permanent or long-term conditions which impact an individual over a period of time, sometimes for their whole lives and sometimes just part of their lives. In the example that I'm showing on screen, we've got a man with a lower arm amputation. Now, temporary impairment, we probably would talk about these as being injuries or conditions that lasted for less than 12 months. So in this case, it's a lady with a broken arm. And then the last one is situational. And this is where the situation that the person is in makes it difficult or impossible to complete an activity. And in this example, we've got a parent holding a baby, making use of her dominant arm. And so that dominant arm can't be used for another task. In these cases, we can understand that each of these different groups have broadly the same requirement to be able to complete an activity using just one arm, and potentially not their dominant arm. They are, however, not necessarily vulnerable. It's only when the circumstance that they are in has not been properly designed to support them that they may become vulnerable. So, for example, if we had a mobile app that required multiple hand gestures to complete an action. And so vulnerability only really occurs when we don't put in place mitigations to ensure that an impairment is supported. Now, vulnerability covers a whole host of circumstances that most of us might find ourselves in our lives, and therefore it can be really difficult to support people who could become vulnerable. So, for example, all of the following could make someone vulnerable, but it's worth noting at this point that just because you're in, or just because you go into one of these circumstances doesn't instantly make you vulnerable. So, for example, buying your first house, having your first baby or having your first child, losing a loved one, gambling addiction, which we'll talk about later on, losing your job, age at both ends of the spectrum, so both old age and those of us who are younger, what we call a non-standard banking requirement. So this is sort of a very banking specific term, and that basically means that because of someone's situation, and they may not have the right documentation or credit status. So for example, someone who's been in the armed forces, someone who's been declared bankrupt, someone whose finances are fluctuating, or someone who might be homeless, for example. And then of course disability, because like I said, whilst there's not a direct link, just because you have a disability doesn't mean you are vulnerable. There is a causal link that says that because of the world around you, and because maybe we don't create solutions which are accessible, you therefore may be vulnerable. And so it's interesting to me that there's all of these different circumstances that broadly we probably don't think about when we design products and services but actually that we should be thinking about. The scale of vulnerability can be really difficult to articulate because of that fluctuating nature of it. And there's a lot of work actually going on in the financial services industry to try and understand vulnerability better. And actually the Association of British Insurers, who are the people who represent insurance companies in the UK, produced a report last year called Addressing Customer Vulnerability. And in that, they talked about a number of groups who were more likely to be particularly vulnerable in financial services. And so I'm going to share a couple of examples that actually give me pause for thought. So the first one is that 1 in 7 adults in the UK have a literacy level lower than expected of a child aged 11 or below. So what that means essentially is that in the UK and in most countries around the world, we set a target for children's reading level, and that by age 11, that should be at a certain level. But 1 in 7 adults have that reading level, so the reading attainment of an 11-year-old or younger. That number changes quite dramatically when it comes to numeracy. So in the UK, it's 1 in 2 adults have a numeracy level lower than an 11-year-old or expected of an 11-year-old. A scary statistic for me actually is this one around 1 in 2, so 50% of adults in the UK have less than £300 in savings. And what that actually means is that most adults are about 2 pay packets away from being made homeless. By 2020, around half of the UK population will have a cancer diagnosis. And it's worth noting that I am using UK statistics here because they were the ones that were easiest to come by, but most of these are prevalent in a lot of Western society. I'm not quite sure if it's the same globally, but generally in Western society. 1 in 6 people over the age of 80 in the UK have dementia or will have dementia in the next couple of years. And around 1 in 8 adults in the UK have an unpaid caring responsibility for a family member or friend. Now, all of these don't automatically make someone vulnerable, but it does increase their chances of becoming vulnerable. Now, all of these obviously have a financial services impact, but actually some of them really do have an impact on pretty much everybody's design and everybody's product. So the fact that we know that literacy and numeracy are poor in the population should make us think about how we write content and the things that we expect people to be able to process at pace. And so it's useful just to think about how these types of statistics could be applied outside of the banking industry. Now, with all of that in mind, both from the perspective of all of those different situations that you could become vulnerable in, plus the statistics, what can we do to incorporate vulnerability into our design using inclusive design principles? Now, there's a number of different versions and different approaches out there regarding inclusive design principles, but the one I'm going to focus on are the inclusive design principles from the team at the Paciello Group, who just happen to be the team that are also running ID24. But what I wanted to do is I'm going to delve into a couple of them, but I wanted just to give everyone a reminder of what these 7 principles are. Now, I'm not going to go into detail for each of them, but you can find the full details and some really, really amazing posters at inclusivedesignprinciples.org. But just as a quick overview, the 7 are provide comparable experience, give control, offer choice, consider situation, be consistent, prioritize content, and add value. And what I'm going to do is talk through 3 of these. Now, the obvious one would be consider situation, and because it's the obvious one, I'm going to leave it alone. And over the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about give control, prioritize content and add value, and look at how we can use those to think about vulnerability and how we can use that to incorporate sort of more inclusiveness around vulnerability into our design. So the first one is give control. And the principles define give control as ensure that people are in control, and people should be able to access and interact with content in their preferred way. Now, in an increasingly frictionless digital world, giving consumers the ability to take back control of processes is an important part of designing for vulnerability. From a financial services point of view, this includes ensuring that there are enough challenge and verification points during a process. So, for example, when you're taking out a loan or credit card. However, it could also include things like building in the ability to delay processing of an order for 24 hours so that people can check that they're happy with the purchases they've made, or to provide them with an opportunity to confirm a purchase the next day. It could also mean allowing a company to alert other people about late night spending, and we'll talk about that in a moment, or cooling off periods for longer term or high value purchases. Or adding an approver into the process, for example, a guardian or helper, so that someone else can support the purchasing decision, action a return, or talk to customer services about an order. Now, what I'm not suggesting here is that we change the existing processes necessarily. What I'm suggesting is that we provide the control options to allow people to do these things. I don't know about you guys, but actually, Amazon One-Click is actually a really dangerous thing for some people, and I know I have been I don't want to say victim, but impacted by Amazon One-Click because it's too easy, it's too frictionless, and actually giving people choice about how much friction and positive friction they want to add back in, I think is a really important consideration that we should all think about. The next one's prioritize content, and the principles talk about prioritizing content as meaning helping users to focus on core tasks, features, and information by prioritizing them within the content and layout. And I think when you're in a vulnerable situation, your ability to process and to make sense of content is made harder. And in 2015, Eric Myers, who is I suppose an old timer of HTML and CSS, talked about the need to design for crisis and for organizations who support individuals financially with their health or well-being or in critical circumstances. In his presentation at Generate London, he talked about having to find out where his daughter had been taken when she was flown by air ambulance to a hospital 150 kilometers away using the hospital's website, and the issues that he encountered just finding out where she had gone. I'd really recommend checking out his video. It's a really interesting and really deep exploration of how this website could have been so much better and supported him and his family at a time of need. If you just search for Eric Myers Designing for Crisis on YouTube, I'll also tweet out the link after this presentation. But when designing for websites or products, it's really worth thinking about those absolute edge cases for when someone is going to come to you, and how you'll be able to help them by designing for vulnerability. So this could include things like the death of a loved one, if they've got financial worries, so for example, gambling addiction, and again we'll talk about that in a minute, or issues that are beyond their control. So I think increasingly we're seeing the lifespan of companies reduce, and there's a big increase in the number of companies going into administration and going out of business and leaving consumers to pick up the pieces. And particularly in financial services, that's a big problem for us, because the first thing someone wants to know is if they've bought something with a company that's gone into administration, well, what do I do about that? Where is my money gone? How do I get it back? I wanted to test out this idea and to see how well our own website managed the idea of prioritizing content for people in crisis or people who are vulnerable. So I'm going to take you through a couple of slides that look at the Barclays website and how we deal with that kind of situation. So this is the Barclays homepage. In fact, it's actually a bit plainer than it used to be. It used to be a lot noisier, but this is what we've got right now. I'm And what I'm going to do is look at it through the eyes of someone who wants to let us know that one of their relatives have died. But before I do that, you might have heard recently that Primera Air went into administration. I think they're a Danish, I think they're a Danish airline. And they left essentially loads of people stranded across the world, including a lot of people from the UK. And so in that situation, the first thing someone wants to know is, well, how am I going to get home, and what can the people who have my money do to help me? And so in situations like that, we've started putting this little banner along the bottom, and the green is actually something I've added, but quite prominent on the page is a here's how you can find out what we can do to help you in that crisis situation. And we've seen this being used in a number of times, for example, when there's been flooding in the UK, when there's been major incidents in London, and all other parts of the UK, where actually we put up a message really quickly to say, look, this is how we can help you. Anyway, what I wanted to do is to get you to think about, well, like, say if you were coming here because you wanted to tell us about the death of a loved one, you probably wouldn't be thinking particularly clearly. Potentially you might be, but the chances are that your cognitive abilities might be reduced a little bit. So thinking about the things that we've got on the site, I thought, from my perspective, I think there's 3 things that people might do. They might want to click on the contact us button because, you know, talking to someone might be the way that they want to do it. They might use search because then they don't have to go trawling through information. Or they might go, well, like, see, it's sort of a support thing, so maybe I click on service and support. So let's kind of go down that rabbit hole a little bit to see what happens. So you open service and support, and you get a lot of well, in this case, unhelpful information, because service and support is a really, really broad topic. But what's, I suppose, a bit more useful is the subsection, which is around help and support. And right at the top, there is help. So when we click on help, we get, you don't get this page, but you get essentially a search box, and you can type in whatever you want. In this case, I typed death because that felt like the most realistic thing someone would type. And you get back 54 results. Now that's a lot of results for the word death, and some of it's really unhelpful. So things like, what happens when my card reader's batteries die? For those of you who don't know, PinSentry is this one-time code generator and needs batteries. So that's not particularly helpful in this particular situation. But we can see that the top result, the most relevant result, is really helpful, and it's written in a way that is a bit more soft. It's not written so much from a banking perspective. It's trying to say, look, actually, we know this is tough. This is not going to be easy for you to do because you're dealing with you're dealing with a bereavement. But here's some things that you can do, and this is how you get started. When you go into that page, we've broken it down into really, really simple steps, and we've sort of gone beyond what we need to do. So we've kind of said, look, we know, the bit that's actually in here for what you have to do for us is number 2. So there's stuff in here that once you've done number 2, you could kind of just stop, and that would be enough from our point of view. But wrapping everything into a single page and in a single place that kind of says, look, we know this is tough. We know that having to register someone's death is not a nice thing to do. And so putting this content and prioritizing the fact that you're going to have to do some stuff before you talk to us. And then actually, once you've talked to us, here's some other things that you probably want to think about, because those things are going to be important to you. Maybe not right now, but really, really soon. So adding value. So add value is the next one that I wanted to talk about. And the principles talk about adding value being the fact that you can consider the value of features and how they improve the experience for different users. By thinking about situations where individuals might be vulnerable, we can think about resources, information, or features which could support a range of different individuals. Now, this could include things like providing resources, signposting, support and tools for first-time buyers. So when I was a first-time buyer relatively recently, I found it really stressful. I was vulnerable because I didn't know what was going on. And so where I did get support from was really useful, and it helped to actually build a bit of loyalty with the brand that I now have my mortgage with. But if there were tools that helped me to work out what are often hidden or difficult to find costs associated with moving, that would add real value to me. Providing a live chat with charities on pages about financial problems, gambling or addiction, so providing that help up front. But then also things like location services, so knowing where someone is when they're asking for help. It might help us to give a different answer, or it might help us to give them their telephone number that's more appropriate. Or indeed, if they're in if they're in a secure environment, like where we can see their transactions, we might be able to go, well, maybe it's worth telling you this piece of information. So we spoke about building positive friction as part of control. And I wanted to give you some examples of companies that are doing this really well. Now, the majority of these are financial services related, as actually I don't really think there's huge amounts of stuff going on outside of financial services. But if there is, I'd love you to tell me, because I really like building these cases of best practice around vulnerability and designing in friction, because I don't think there's enough organizations really thinking about the power that friction has when it's designed properly. So the first one is around gambling addiction. I said that we talk about that. It's been in the news quite a lot recently in the UK, and so it's particularly topical. Apologies, I know it's obviously a global conference, but it's particularly relevant in the UK right now. In the UK, gambling addiction affects 430,000 people, and the Gambling Commission, which is the kind of regulator for the gambling industry, estimates that nearly 2 million people in the UK are at risk of becoming addicted to gambling. Starling, who are a challenger bank, so they're a new to the market, and they only offer like a mobile-only service, recently launched a payment block, which allows customers to decide to block transactions on gambling websites and in gambling shops. And it does this using a thing called category codes, or merchant category codes, which banks and payment providers set up against individual companies. Now, it means that stuff like doing the lottery wouldn't get included, but for people whose main source of revenue is through gambling, it would include those. Now, this is a really positive step, and we've seen lots of really good press about it. And if you are interested, there's a really interesting article on the BBC News website called "A Banking App Helped Me Beat My Addiction." But whilst this is a really positive step, the downside of the Starling approach is that you can easily re-enable the payment within the app with no additional friction. So whilst they've put friction in to kind of slow you down, it's really easy to switch the friction off. And so what this could lead to is people basically having a flutter because they feel like it's the right thing that they want to do right now. Now, the Gambling Commission are putting more pressure on the financial services industry and asking the financial services industry to do more. And actually, there's another example of where this has gone a step further. And Monzo Bank, who are kind of in the same category as Starling, they're a challenger bank, so they're quite new to the market. They're relatively small still, and they're mobile-based only. Have taken, like I say, have taken this a step further. So once you block gambling payments, if you want to unblock those payments and you want to be able to start making gambling transactions, then you have to talk to someone via live chat to get it re-enabled. And only once you do that, and you wait 48 hours, will you be able to do that. Now, it does pose an interesting question about the right to spend your money as you want to. And actually, the people at Monzo have said that they're not judging when they have these conversations. What they're doing is challenging and adding some positive friction back into the process. So when you talk to someone at Monzo using the live chat, they'll ask you things like, has your situation changed since you first switched on this restriction? And the idea is to provide challenge back to the customer to allow them to properly consider if it's the right decision for them, and to give them some space to consider what the implication of going back to gambling is. What this highlights is the importance of the human touch when it comes to supporting and designing for vulnerability. Look, regardless of how good technology is, that human touch and human intuition is far more powerful than any computer. Remembering this is really going to be important as we move more and more towards a digital-first economy. In another example, actually from Monzo, and it's a slightly different example, but primarily because it's not been implemented. But a few years ago, Monzo proposed including a review option for late night spending purchases to support customers with mental health issues. The idea being that the customer could say they wanted to review a transaction the next morning before they actually completed the transaction. Now, like I said, it hasn't been implemented, but at its heart, it's giving people who know that they have what I call a late night spend and a early morning regret cycle, so spending lots late at night because at that moment it feels like it's the best thing in the world, and then regretting it the next day. It's giving those people more control over their spending. Now, one of the challenges with this is how do you get companies to honor this approach? How do you get, in this example, ASOS and eBay and Amazon and Marks and Spencer's and Amazon to listen to the fact that you said you don't want that transaction anymore? Well, with the world of open banking, which is the ability to share your banking information with other banks and companies, this potentially becomes a bigger possibility because banks and financial services organizations and payment providers could become more integrated into the purchase journey and make this a reality. So what can you do to start thinking about vulnerability now that you know more? Well, there's a few things that I'd suggest. First, include vulnerability in your design thinking, whether it's as part of your research into consumer behavior, embedding it into your persona creation, or running workshops with specific groups who may have been vulnerable when using your product. It will give you an insight into their experiences. You could also include people with experience of vulnerability in things like user testing, whether that's upfront during your development or right at the just before you go live. I'm not necessarily saying that you should find people who are currently vulnerable because I think there's probably some ethical issues with that. But finding people who have been through a specific period of vulnerability for a specific reason will be really beneficial. The third one would be to find ways to make it okay to say. I did another talk on this topic a couple of months ago that you can find on YouTube, where I talk about the power of data to really help us start to spot vulnerability and in particular financial vulnerability. But actually, the most powerful way and the best and the most cost-effective and the most accurate way is to let people tell you that they're vulnerable. Give them the opportunity to flag that they know that they are vulnerable and that they want your support. So making it okay to say. I've talked about using data to spot vulnerability, and like I say, there's a whole other talk that's on YouTube. Just put my name in and UXPA, you'll find it. But with the volume of data we create every single day and the skill of people like data scientists, we can and should be looking for patterns that might suggest vulnerability. And the last one is make your people aware of vulnerability. So whether it's designers, whether it's support teams, social media teams, people who are engaging with customers or engaging with other organizations that represent your customer base, give them the tools and skills to not only identify people who might be vulnerable or at risk of vulnerability, but to be able to support them. Plus, those data insights that you might be creating, make sure you give it to them so that they can be empowered. Because like I said, technology can only take us so far. Human intuition and the human touch is what's really going to help ensure that the designs that we create really have an effect when it comes to vulnerability. So as a quick recap, vulnerability can and will probably affect all of us at some point in our lives. There are loads of reasons why you can become vulnerable. Some of them are personal to us, and some of them are because of other people, events, or circumstances. Inclusive design principles and an inclusive design mindset gives us all a framework and an opportunity to embrace vulnerability as part of design. Think about giving control, prioritizing content, and adding value. And finally, whilst this is really a hot topic right now in financial services, I think we all have a responsibility to think about vulnerability in everything that we do. And that's it. If you'd like to get in touch, there's a couple of ways. We've got a couple of Twitter accounts. So at Barclays Access, we'll be tweeting along the whole day. If you want to just tweet at me, it's at CFUNN. email address, david.caldwell@barclays.com. And then we've got 2 places that you can find out more about what we're doing around accessibility and inclusive design. And it's barclayscorporate.com/accessibility or barclays.co.uk/accessibility.
That's great. Thank you very much, David. It was a fantastic presentation. I saw a lot of compliments on Twitter. I haven't seen a lot of questions. But I did like a couple of the points you raised. I was lucky enough to actually catch Eric's talk in person a couple of years ago, and it is very powerful. I think I would recommend that anybody that can or has the time to seek out that video, they should watch it. It is very great. And I would also like to compliment you on the work that Barclays has been doing. The posters you made for the inclusive design principles are fantastic. I use them in my own trainings a lot. I recommend that groups, when I visit them, that they print them out, they hang them, they put them somewhere where everyone can see them. So I just wanted to, publicly thank you for the work that you've done there, because you have given us some fantastic resources.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Absolutely. And I think it's a really interesting area, this idea that it's the circumstances that make someone vulnerable as opposed to any particular condition or ability or disability that the person themselves might have. As a blind person, I'm very well aware of this, and echo Billy's compliments to Barclays for all you're doing. To remove some of those vulnerable circumstances, clear the way so that people who do find themselves restricted in some way can, operate through life more independently and competently, which is incredibly important.
Yeah, no, completely agree.
Awesome. That was wonderful. Okay. So a quick reminder to everyone that Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you in partnership with Barclays Access, PACE Group, Intopia, Microsoft Edge, and Open Access Technologies. And with thanks to our supporters, DQ Systems. As Billy mentioned at the start of the hour, please do hit that subscribe button on the YouTube channel. It's nice to know you're all out there and tuning in and supporting this event. And if you have any questions for David or any of our other presenters, you can, of course, tweet them to us with the ID24 hashtag. Billy, what have we got coming up next?
So coming up next at the top of the hour, we have Brendan Roach and Lucy Ruck with Tackling Disability as a Global Business Issue.
Oh, that'll be a good talk.
Absolutely. Don't go away. We'll be back on the hour.